My friends, it looks like we are live. How do you do? It's good to be with you. I'm Bradley J, and we are joined by Anthony M. Sammarco, who is the author of many a book. But today we're going to be dealing with a book called Community Boating, Inc. Let me tell you a little story about how we arrived at where we're at now. For a few years, at least a couple of summers, an acquaintance of mine, a friend, longtime friend, said, you should come out onto the Charles and sail, learn to sail. And I said, yeah. But finally, this summer, I just went out with him because I could. And I was struck by what a wonderful thing community boating, Boston community boating is. And said, I happen to know that Anthony had written a book on the subject. And I said, I have to talk to him about it so we can share this wonderful resource with more people and get them involved. So here is Anthony with us this fine August morning. Anthony, how do you do?
I'm very well. How do you do?
I do very well. It was fun to get out on the Charles, and it's just amazing that community boating exists, because sailing is thought to be sort of a high-end type of thing that's expensive and not available to everyone. But due to the hard work of some folks, it is available to most anyone, even people with special needs can get out onto the water, and you're here to tell us all about it. So first, I guess I'm curious how you came to write this book. Generally, you write books about neighborhoods, but this is a little bit different. How did this take place?
Well, ironically, I went to day school with Douglas Lee, who was the son of Joseph Lee Jr. So I knew community boating throughout my lifetime, and I was well aware of how it actually had an outreach program to people of all walks of life. I love how you said people that were physically challenged actually can go into these boats. And in a lot of ways, what they did was to offer it not just to adults from the ages of 20 on up, but they also had these huge numbers of programs that attracted inner city children. So during the period of the 1960s and 1970s, I was always well aware of it because Douglas Lee had lived on Beacon Hill, and we basically knew the story. So I was contacted by Community Boating to see if I'd be interested. And when I did say yes, because of course I had a background with it, it turned out they had no archive. So I had to create an archive to actually do the book. And I think sometimes when you think of community boating, which is from the late 1930s to the present, you would think that over 75, almost 80 years, that this would be something that would be ingrained in people's history. But it took a while. And I think one of the concepts is that I tried in this book in a diligent way to actually show people that truly are from all walks of life, even though Joseph Lee Jr. was not only the son of Joseph Lee, who was the Boston Brahmin who became the founder of the playground movement, but he was also someone who was a nephew of not only James and Helen Storrow, for whom Storrow Drive is named, but he was also related to Leverett Saltonstall and many other Brahmins who supported community boating. So when he said this, community boating, in such a way that it was boating for all, it was truly something that made it special and included people, not only the children of Beacon Hill and the West End, but children that would ride their bicycles or walk from as far away as Newton, Brighton, Alston, as well as South Boston and Dorchester. So it truly was something when I wrote this book that even I learned things that were really quite important and interesting.
Can you talk a little bit more about Joseph Lee and drill down on who he was and why he was motivated, perhaps, to do this?
Well, Joseph Lee was not only the son of Joseph and Margaret Copley Cabot Lee, but he was a Boston Brahmin born and bred. The family was an extremely well-to-do family that lived on Mount Vernon Street on Beacon Hill. But he was someone who was a little bit of a renegade. And though he actually did attend Harvard, he actually dropped out and would actually become a member of a dude ranch in the West. In a lot of ways, he was somebody who was his own man. And during the period of the 1930s, he and his wife would actually live on what is today Anderson and Myrtle Street, which was a simple 4-story 19th century house, but they lived on the top floor. He had no heirs whatsoever. And during that period of time, he was somebody who not only dedicated himself to public service, just like his father before him, but he was somebody in a lot of ways that actually enjoyed boating. Now, the family had a summer house in Cohasset, and as a result, most young people that live on the water do learn to boat. And in this instance, he himself actually tried to introduce it to the children of the West End of Boston. Now, Douglas Lee, who is my age, is someone in a lot of ways that was raised with this. His father was not only a community service leader, he served as chairman of the Boston School Committee. He was also a proponent for saving of the West End of Boston. But he was also somebody in some ways that included children of all walks of life. And the story went that in the early 1930s, he decided to build a boat on the roof of his house on the north slope of Beacon Hill. He had 2 nephews, Kenny and Denny Robertson. And because they were staying with them for the summer, they decided to keep them not only occupied and active, but by building a boat, they were able to actually bring it down to the Charles River and try to float it. And it did float. And as a result, that was something that not only was enjoyable, but led to all sorts of legal battles. There were people who were the members of the Boston Park Commission that said that it was illegal to actually float your own boat on the Charles River. So throughout the 1930s, Joseph Lee was somebody who not only included children in this aspect of community boating, but seemed to deal with all of the problems of politics of Boston.
So he had to fight the authorities to make this happen?
He most certainly did. And in the book, I actually have a chapter which I call The Quest of Joseph Lee. And it is said in the Boston Globe that Joseph Lee, a social worker and educator, was convinced that disadvantaged children living throughout the tenements in Boston could benefit from learning how to sail. Well, during that period of time, it wasn't just the fact that he had to petition the governor of the Commonwealth, which was primarily Governor Hurley and then Leverett Saltonstall, his first cousin, but he had to deal with a man by the name of Eugene Hultman. And Hultman was not only the commissioner of the Boston Parks Department, but he had served as the commissioner of the Boston Police, the Boston Fire, and the Building Department. So he was the consummate politician. And he was somebody who took a dislike, not only to Joseph Lee Jr., but he was somebody who tried to thwart him at every turn. And the idea was that here was Joseph Lee having a small area off of what was the embankment, part of the Storrow Drive. And here was his aunt and uncle actually having given $1 million to create Storrow Drive and what we know today as partly the Esplanade and the embankment. And during that period of time, he had to petition his aunt and uncle to actually say that some of the income of the Storrow Trust could be used for community boating.
So I understand that a lot of the boats back in the day were handcrafted, not just the one Joseph Lee built, but unlike today, where they're manufactured, mass-produced, people actually made them.
They did. And Joseph Lee, when I mentioned earlier his 2 nephews, the Robertson boys, they actually handcrafted these on the roof of that house. And during that period of the 1930s, what he did was not only to allow these children to learn how to sail, but they learned how to build the boats and maintain them. And as you know, a boat that's actually in the water for the entire summer, when it is taken to dry dock, it actually has to be not only sanded, caulked, and then, of course, painted. But he taught these young people all sorts of different ways, not only from the production, but to the maintenance. And the Joseph Lee boats, of which I do have photographs in the book that actually show them in the late 1930s, were used for close to 20 years. Now, in some ways, when you look at these boats, you had to realize they did cost a little bit of money. But Joseph Lee, along with his sister, Miss Mary Lee, and many other people in the Boston area, made donations to this charitable cause. And it wasn't just the fact that they were making a donation to help build the boats, but it was also something that made the children begin to realize in some ways there was more than just a tenement and a street in the West End. But now the Charles River Basin, which was this beautiful area that in the 1930s had been really created as green space, thanks to the Staros' munificent gift, were able in some ways to go down there on a daily basis and sail. And one of the things was it was only $1 a year. Young people could actually sail. And the idea was that $1, which was a lot of money in the 1930s and 1940s, was actually something that they could afford, but they were part of it. And I think Joseph Lee was somebody who actually made not just adults, but also made children in some ways feel a part of this community of boating. And Community Boating Incorporated, as it's known today, 80 years later, is a great example of that inclusiveness, and he was a master of it.
Having recently experienced the community boating experience, I was able to view Boston from the river, and not only that, view the bridges from the river. And it's a pretty finite space you get to sail in. You sail up to the Mass Ave Bridge, then you head the other way and sail to the Salt and Pepper Bridge. And the interesting thing is, when I look at the photos in your book, they had exactly the same experience all those years ago. You can tell by the photos. It felt to them like it feels to anybody on that river today. It's pretty cool.
It is. And you know, the whole concept of utilizing our water resources in Boston is something that, you know, we've seen, you know, the taming of the Muddy River and the creation of the green space. But for Joseph Lee Jr. to actually tame the Charles River Basin and to allow people to enjoy themselves in such a way with what was once really an upper class Brahmin resort type aspect of boating. Here in Austerville on Cape Cod, we have catboats, and at the club, we see many people, you know, with their catboats on the ocean. But one of the things was that he also named these boats that he created with these young people after people such as his cousin, Governor Leverett Saltonstall. Now, the boat that he called the Saltonstall boat was a 3-mast schooner, and you began to realize in some ways that it was also an honor to have a boat named after a person, but it was also something you had to realize that Leverett Saltonstall supported the community boating, especially against Eugene Helpman. So it went the gamut. Governor Hurley, Governor Saltonstall, and eventually Governor Robert Bradford, another.
Uh-oh. Anthony seems to have frozen computer-wise. So I'll chat a little bit and maybe he'll come back. Or actually, if he doesn't come back, I'll bleep him out and maybe he'll return. This is where a talk show host makes his money. Well, can make their money. I do want to thank, by the way, Phil and Peter. Phil's an old friend. Peter's a new friend, for taking me out on the river and allowing me to experience what we're talking about. Community Boating Inc., Boston Community Boating. They have lots and lots of boats. I thought maybe it'd be impossible to get one because everyone would be clamoring to do it, but they have a lot of boats. So Phil was able to get out there and bring me, Phil and Peter. And they say that it's a good place to learn to sail because you have to do a lot of sailing. You have to actually do stuff all the time. On the harbor, you can set a direction and just continue that way. Whereas on the Charles, you have to continually tack and watch out for heavy traffic and you reverse direction. You have to pay attention. The wind's changing all the time. And you also run into situations where you get near the shore and the wind is reduced because of the trees. So I guess it's a good place to actually learn how to sail. And anybody who wants to go for it can pay a reasonable amount of money, really pretty affordable, and take a couple classes. I don't exactly know how many classes, but 2-ish. And you have to be tested, but it seems pretty doable. Let's rejoin Anthony. Are you there, brother?
I am, and I apologize. I don't know what happened.
That's all right. In the meantime, I was explaining how you, while you were gone, I was explaining how you join and the procedure. So it worked out okay. I'm glad you're back. Great.
Thank you.
Where were we?
Well, we were talking about how the three governors, Governor Hurley, Governor Saltonstall, and then, of course, Governor Bradford, all supported community boating. So I think in a lot of ways, people on Beacon Hill realized that when Joseph Lee Jr. and his stalwart group of young men and women would actually march up Beacon Hill and, of course, holding one of these boats, they realized how important it was to the community. Now, one of the things is the boathouse itself is something that survives from the period of the early 1940s. And that boathouse is really quite a beautiful place. But it actually has above the sign, which is boathouse, sailing here for all.
Right.
During that period of time, they would have a shield on the side, and people either walking on the esplanade or driving by, and it would have this shield-shaped sign that said, "Sailboats, come aboard for Mr., Mrs., and Miss." And in that way, it was an inclusive aspect and invitation for people of all walks of life to come and enjoy sailing. Now, the boathouse itself, which actually has changed a little bit, they've added a second story, but it was designed by a man by the name of William Roger Greeley, who was a principal architect with Killam, Hopkins, and Greeley, a very well-known Boston architectural firm in Boston. And though it only cost $55,000 at the time to build, it was something that when it was dedicated in 1941 by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, it only paid $1 per year to the MDC, or what is today the Department of Recreation and Conservation. So it had not just that aspect of permanence, but it also had something that was beautifully decorated. It had these wonderful friezes on the sides of not only boats, but also sailboats, actually along with a crow's nest that had a flagpole at the very top. So what they were doing was really making something that was available at one time only to the very wealthy as sailing, now available to people of all walks of life. And it was said that by 1939, there were 20 sailboats and 4 three-mast schooners, all of which had been built by Joseph Lee Jr. and a group of people that would eventually include various professors of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So it really was a major thing in Boston, and still is today.
3-mast schooners?
Yes.
On the river.
On the river. Leverett Saltonstall, which was a 3-mast schooner, was one of the biggest. And you had to realize it took probably 6 people to actually man that. But, Joseph Lee Jr. also wrote a book that actually, in words, taught one how to sail. And you had to realize this was something that came very easy to him because, as I mentioned, his family had summited in Cohasset from the time he was born. He knew what he was doing, but not everybody had the capabilities, like you do, of course, to actually sail on the Charles River Basin. I've always found it very difficult myself. But there was the fact of building a boat, making a sail, and they actually had ways to actually show you how to make sails from discarded sheets from the Massachusetts General Hospital, and a man in the area of the West End who actually put grommets in that sheet to allow them to thread it with rope. So in that instance, it was something that was really a community-based endeavor. People helped not only to donate discarded sheets, but in this instance to also make it something that the children learned not only how to do ropes, how to do knots, but also how to actually thread it through the gormets and then raise the sail so you could actually sail on the harbor.
One thing that's a real bonus is you don't need a car to get there. You can take the T to the Charles Street station and simply cross up a bunch of crosswalks to get out of that circle and then go over the bridge and you're there. Boom.
It is. I think one of the things is when I did this, every Wednesday afternoon, I would leave my office. I would park somewhere around Boston Common. I'd walk the length of Charles Street and go up and over the Leverett Bridge. And I would arrive at community boating, usually exhausted. But by the time I got there, the breeze off the basin was absolutely wonderful. And people were very helpful. It was the type of a thing that many people who had been at the community boating for many years began to realize in some ways how important Joseph Lee and Audrey and Leo Manfredi really had been from the period of the late 1930s right through to the 1960s. So this was something that was not only community boating, but it was something that made people feel that this was really special, and it truly was. But they didn't allow you out on the ocean, let alone the outer areas. It was only on the basin. So to teach you, they had what was called shore school. Now, shore school was something that was said to be by a man by the name of Brendan O'Brien, and he actually helped in writing this book. He actually had been a member of the shore school, and he said that shore school has always been a popular 6-week class that demonstrated proper sailing techniques. So if you didn't take that 6-week course, you could not go out on the Charles River Basin. And I think in that instance, you began to realize how many different things you had to learn. Well, shore class was important, but you also wore this special jersey. They called it a chicken stripe t-shirt, and it went from the upper left shoulder across, and it actually had a very simple stripe. And that was something that all the young people would wear. But these shore classes would bring dozens of people, both children and adults, to actually sit and listen, in many instances, to teenagers who would actually tell you the stories of how to properly sail. So there were people such as Steve Winkler and, of course, Brendan O'Brien, and many others, included Leo Manfredi, who actually looked to it that made many people feel comfortable, like yourself, going out in the boat. So I think sometimes when you begin to realize that it is a fairly large basin, the Charles River Basin, but it is also something in many ways that made people realize that they had to take a course. And it was a protective course, not only for them, but for you too. And in that way, they showed you the proper techniques, not only how to actually use the tiller, but also how to let the sail catch the wind. And in that way, you only really learn it by doing it. So you could take shore class for 12 weeks, but unless you're on that boat and doing these various routine type things to sail, you're never really going to learn.
I was impressed by a couple of things when I was there. I've been there twice to experience it. One is how friendly the culture is and welcoming. It's not Trader Joe's, but it has that upbeat friendliness that makes you feel good when you're there. The other is the really excellent organization. You say they started out with a few boats, 8 or 16 or 20. They must have, 80 or 100 now. They have a lot of boats coming and going and coming and going, and they seem to have a handle on all of them. They seem very organized.
Charlie Zeckel has been the executive director for the last few years, and he does a commendable job. But you're right, they do have people coming and going, and they have specific clubs within community boating, women's boating, children's boating. They have handicapped people that are physically challenged in wheelchairs are encouraged to come to not only these shore classes, but they also in some ways are fitted to allow them to actually sail. Now, one of the things when I was doing this book, I found that they actually had people from the Perkins Institution for the Blind. And many of these young people, they had one handicap, they were blind. But they too were allowed to sail. They would actually have an assistant, and in that aspect, they too handled the tiller. And of course, there was nothing wrong with their hearing, there was nothing wrong with their feel, but they could help to actually guide the boat. So when I did the book, I was a little astonished. But Joseph Lee Jr., his inclusiveness was incredible. And he had an elder son, Joseph Lee III. And in the book, I have a photograph of him actually tending to the sail that's actually being raised. And the boat he's actually sailing is called the Pride of the West End Community House. Now, remember, Joseph Lee was trying to get the young children of Boston's West End to come and realize that boating was something that really was truly, it transcended community. It allowed people of all walks of life to sail. It didn't matter who you were. If you learned properly how to sail, you too could be a success. Well, the young boy was somebody, granted, raised in a very affluent family, but the idea was that they established this to encourage, to build and foster a strong sense of urban community and to hopefully improve the quality of life of residents of all ages. Well, these boats, which had a sturdy frame and were hewn from 24-foot long pine boards, were something that when they created the boat and not only sailed it, but in the fall, they actually began to, when they brought it out of the water, allow it to be caulked, sanded, prepared, and painted, and then stored over winter. It was more than just sailing. It was truly learning in some ways a sense of responsibility. It was a sense of not only maturity, but it was also a sense of fun. And if you had fun and you had that responsibility and the maturity, I think in a lot of ways it was probably proof positive of what Joseph Lee Jr. was trying to do.
One final question, which is a question that I should have asked a while ago. How did the builders of the boats on the roofs or the roof get the boats down after building them?
Well, don't forget, they weren't 24-foot long boats. But during the period of 1930s, you had to realize that he was bringing wood from many hardware stores up to the roof of that building, 4-story building. Well, just like on a steamship, as a lifeboat is allowed to descend from the building itself, they had 2 davits, and it would simply allow the boat to be brought down. They had to then carry it to the foot of the hill. And when they got to the foot of the hill and they were able to go across, Storrow Drive in the 1930s was not impeded with a fence that didn't allow you to go directly to the water, but they would bring it. It was something that was not only done, but it was also then that area where they got in trouble. And the Boston Police Department arrested Joseph Lee Jr. on numerous occasions because he was thwarting the efforts of Eugene Halterman to keep his boats from the Charles River Basin. So in a lot of ways, I think it was what you might really call a homegrown effort. But by the 1940s, it had become something that really was known throughout Boston. And it was something that was a real important aspect because it allowed people not only to grow in confidence in sailing a boat, but as I said, maturity and responsibility. And it really instilled in these young people of the West End of Boston, who initially were the people that actually did community boating, but then by the 1940s, the metropolitan Boston area. And I can't tell you how many people would tell me that they had actually learned to sail actually at community boating. So not only with scholarships allowing you to only pay $1 per year, it today is something in some ways that is a much more broad-based aspect. And they constantly try to raise the consciousness of Bostonians to utilize the Charles River Basin as a beautiful resource. And of course, like you did, to experience Boston from the ocean or the water. It's something that's really a wonderful aspect. And one of the things I want to say is that in the book, I quote this: the community boating of Boston has long been a prominent part of the city, and its presence on the Charles River Basin is not just popular, but also a major anchor. Here, one of the sailboats is superimposed on a contemporary photograph of the clubhouse, docks, and high rises of the Back Bay of Boston. And this whole aspect of community boating's wonderful logo over the city of Boston, it's one of those resources that many of us are well aware of, but in many instances, not everyone knows the wonderful feature that you too can participate in. So it's a really fun place, especially in the summer months in the hot city of Boston.
So we did have a comment from Michael McGinn. It says the program for Boston area kids, $1 for the summer, creates. That makes it seem like it's still $1 a summer. I think it's a bit more than that, but originally it was $1 a year. Correct?
Yes.
All right.
And it does. He says it creates a lifelong friendship. And of course, it's an amazing Boston asset. It truly is. Do you know, when I was doing this book, there were people such as Brendan O'Brien and, of course, many other people such as Steve Winkler and Winkler's wife, who was a daughter of the Manfredis. They were lifelong friends. And it was something that did foster that sense of friendship, but it also fostered a sense of fun. So when you do go out in the boat, I'm still frightened, but I still go out. I realize in some ways that it is a resource that many people in Boston don't even know exists. So I think you're doing a service, Bradley. You're creating something that makes people begin to realize the wonderful resources of the city of Boston. And I hope you learn to sail that little boat all the way around the basin.
So first, let me thank Boston Community Boating Inc., Boston Community Boating, for all that they do. They work really hard, and they do provide a wonderful, wonderful service. It makes Boston a better place. Thing number two, again, let me thank Phil Lorenzo. Phil Lorenzo is the guy that kept after me to get out on the water. And once I went out with him, he's a very good instructor, and he's 100% pro community boating. So I owe this interview would not have taken place if it were not for Phil,
Wow.
who's my very old friend, and his sailing partner, Peter, who's my new friend. And finally, thanks to you, Anthony Sammarco. Anthony's the author of now close to 1 billion books, is it?
Only 85.
85. I figured you'd be getting up to, when I met you, I think it was like 75 or something, maybe fewer than that.
Well, last evening I was working on my new guide to the Boston Freedom Trail for about 2 hours. So I'm actually having a lot of fun, but I'm working in the garden more this summer than I normally had because I've retired. And I think in a lot of ways these books will be a shelf book for many, many people. And I hope people realize in some ways it's a way to preserve history. So let's have fun. We should meet and come to the dock, and maybe you can take me away in such a way that I can actually go out on the boat with you when you learn it after shore school.
Okay. Now about what you're doing, more about what you're doing now. You have the recent book, The Other Red Line, about Boston's combat zone,
Yes.
which you can get out there. You can get these books not only on Amazon, but the fun thing is, when I was getting my COVID shots, I was in a pharmacy, and there's a rack packed with Anthony's books. And I think that's cool because you see books sometimes about the neighborhood that the books are actually being sold in, which I like. What are the current books that are in the pipe that just have come out and are in the pipeline?
Well, the pipeline right now is Mission Hill Through Time and, of course, Mattapan Through Time. And those should be out by the fall of 2021. I'm also writing a Boston Tradition book, which is actually Halloween traditions in Boston. That'll be out for Halloween next year. And of course, Valentine's Day traditions in Boston, which will be out for Valentine's Day 2022. So I think in a lot of ways, each of these books are really important, but we've actually begun discussing. Peter Kingman is my photographer, and I feel indebted to this man. He is the Ansel Adams of Boston. But the idea I'm trying to do in some ways is to chronicle neighborhood history, primarily in the 20th century. Beautiful photographs, but more of the recent past than 100 years ago. So we're going to begin doing a book on the West End of Boston.
Okay.
And though much of the area is demolished, there's enough to actually create a sense of a neighborhood book.
There's a significant amount about the West End in Community Boating Inc.,
Yes.
which you'll see when, not if, but when you pick it up. Barton Nats, will you be doing any book signings this fall anywhere?
Well, I hope I will. One of the concepts is for the last 2 years, it's been very difficult to do book signings. The whole concept of COVID-19 was that most people wanted to do things by Zoom, which was fine. But I truly like to meet people when I do my lectures and have a book signing. So hopefully this fall, when the West End Library reopens, we'll be able to do not just a book signing on the community boating book, but I hope to do the one on the other red line. Your viewers should know that this book was written in your honor. It was something that we had actually discussed on your wonderful show on WBZ iHeartRadio. And I think sometimes when you realize from Scully Square to the combat zone, this was something that went the gamut from our grandparents' age right through to our age. And it truthfully, in some ways, is a little bit different. It's a little more salacious, but it actually is something that makes history fun. It comes to life.
Yes. I have another idea for you. I'll tell you. I'll spill it right now, and I'm sure you thought of it.
All right.
I'm going to raise my hand and vote for it. You know how we went to Jacob Worth just prior to his demise?
I do.
There are many restaurants of that ilk which could surely fill a book with interesting material.
I do.
Photos.
Well, I think it's not just restaurants, but I mean, you remember the shows what we would do about things that have closed? I mean, department stores, restaurants, movie houses. There's so much to realize that Boston's urban renewal, so to speak, and constant change is something that embraces people of all generations. But you're right. Restaurants, I begin to realize in some ways, and I wonder sometimes, is it still open? But being in the Cape for the summer, it's just, though I'm back and forth to town, I usually hit the same places. But I think that would be a great story.
By the way, I have, since Jacob Worth closed, I walk by from time to time and peek in the window. The last time I did, they had not taken the furniture. It still seemed like it was reopenable.
Yes, it is. I think one of the concepts is that the restaurant, which was such an anchor in Boston since the 19th century, it would be wonderful if somebody could just simply reopen it. There was no place better than the Wiener Schnitzel or the Sauerbraten that was actually served at Jacob Worth's. And with a glass of whatever type of beer they suggested, it was always something that was really quite fun. And the evening we went, we really did enjoy ourselves, if I remember correctly.
Yep.
So I think
you could reopen it yourself. It could be a project.
Wow, that sounds good.
And you could even write your books in the table in the back as you sip a martini. It'd be
sounds
perfect.
good to me. Yeah. Well, I think
some of your rich organizations that you are pals with, they could do it, or the city of Boston can buy that. Why couldn't the city of Boston preserve history, buy it, and run it like it was in its halcyon days?
Well, you say that, but I think one of the things is I'm going to give a kudos to Kathy Kotorides. She herself, in a lot of ways, is somebody who has created a sense of what today preserves history. And I think sometimes when you see buildings themselves, such as Jacob Worth's, which are 1840 row houses, typical of what would have been in that area, much like Bay Village or the South Cove, they should preserve them, but it would really be important to preserve this as a restaurant. So I give a little bit of a hope that some of these buildings themselves are saved, but they're saved in a way to actually reinvent them as something. And it would be great if Jacob Worth reopened under a different ownership but kept the same name. But I think in a lot of ways, the city continues to change the building, the residential base, and of course, Boston's population is increasing by leaps and bounds. So one needs as much residential as we do need commercial. So Boston itself changes.
In this age of what I would say are boring buildings and boring new architecture, unremarkable, it's ever more important to hang on to the Jacob Worths of our city. Thanks so much, Anthony Sammarco, and look forward to our next hang, if you will. Thanks, thanks very much.
Take care.
Bye-bye, and bye to all of you. Thank you all.